Thank you very much, and I apologize in advance that I'm going to, well, my German is still quite dodgy, so for the sake of your patience at this late time of the day, I'm going to deliver this quick lecture in English, and maybe next time we'll work on the German version. So thank you very much, President Bicycle, for the warm welcome tonight and over the last year. And it's been a tremendous pleasure and very fruitful to join the university community here. And distinguished, honorable minister and mayor and distinguished visitors and scholars, thanks for coming tonight and for agreeing to spend the next 30 minutes, I hope, talking a little bit about comparative constitutionalism and its potential contribution to the theme of this conference, science for peace, sustainability, and perhaps social responsibility. So I'm going to take you for a quick ride around the world in the next 30 minutes, and then we'll see what comes out of it. Okay, so the title of the talk is Comparative Constitutionalism Towards a Science for Peace and Sustainability, and there will be quite a few slides, so I hope you can see well. So let's start with the most obvious. So we all know these two, we all recognize what we see here. Of course, the German Basic Law, it's one of the fundamental documents in the politics and legal order of this country, and increasingly so around the world. It's widely cited, and of course the German Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, that those of you who follow constitutional jurisprudence will know that it has gained momentum and publicity worldwide. Courts around the world look up to the German Constitutional Court and cite its decisions quite frequently. So this is well known to many of you. These guys you also know quite well. And I hope that many of you also know this, and this will tell you how significant what we study is for understanding the political outcomes. So as many of you will know, Hillary Clinton actually received 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. However, and that translates into over 48% of the popular vote, as opposed to 46% that Donald Trump received. However, due to an outdated, I guess we could say, antiquated constitutional order that was adopted in the late 18th century and is very difficult to change in the electoral college structure, it so happens that Hillary Clinton won just 232 electoral college votes, and Donald Trump 306, which of course made the world a different place. So the bottom line is, of course, we cannot take lightly the significance of constitutional structures in determining political outcomes. So, you know, the German setting and the US setting we know quite well, but let's perhaps move to describe perhaps the more global aspects of this transition to constitutionalism and the significance of constitutionalism, constitutional texts, constitutional courts in determining political outcomes, and its significance, and this is the theme of our conference here over the next 3 days, its significance for peace, sustainability, and social engagement with science. So I hope you can see well. This is a simple one-line graph that depicts the global expansion of constitutions over the last 200 and some years. So it's quite striking. I mean, it doesn't, you know, it's quite striking to see the, is this the red dot here? Yes. So it's quite striking to see the rise from the, you know, the 20th century, and in particular immediately after World War II, all the way to 200 constitutions. So although we are familiar with the German setting and perhaps with the American setting, this is a global trend that has expanded dramatically over the last 50 years, in particular in the post-World War II era, and of course the collapse of the communist bloc and the transition to democracy in Latin America in the 80s and in Asia, Africa, etc. So we are talking about a tremendous global trend, and we cannot overestimate its political significance. So the trend is obvious. Now, its impact on day-to-day occurrences around the world is dramatic. I'm just going to quickly, so what you see on the left hand here is the Constitution, that's right here. You see the Constitution of South Sudan. It's one of the most recent countries that joined this global trend. I'm just showing you how widespread is this. What we see here is a constitutional demonstration in Iceland, and what we see here is a celebration of the adoption of a new constitution in Nepal after 65 years of back and forth civil war, dictatorship, and so on. We also see the day-to-day significance around the world in other issues or aspects that many of you have heard about. So anyone recognizes who this lady is? This is Gina Miller, well known from the Miller vs. United Kingdom case of the British Supreme Court. And if you take this decision lightly, that's a mistake, because we all talk about Brexit. So what the UK Supreme Court did following an application of this lady here, Gina Miller, is to declare that the UK cannot invoke Section 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, basically cannot opt out of the EU without a vote in Parliament. I'm simplifying matters, but that's the bottom line. So the bottom line is that the Brexit referendum is not enough for the UK government to opt out of the EU, and there ought to be a parliamentary vote that is yet to take place. And this was based upon the Supreme Court, the UK Supreme Court to your right there, and its interpretation of the British Constitution and the EU emerging constitution. What you see here, obviously, many of you will recognize the Spanish context and Catalonia. And what is this 155 thing? This is a crucial section of the Spanish Constitution that allows the government in Madrid to centrally control the states, yes, the Spanish Länder, if you will. And so assume control over Catalonia via the Spanish Constitution, and the Spanish Constitutional Court decided that the government can do this. I'm just showing you this to show you how significant these things are, although we don't take them too seriously in day-to-day discourse. And then to the right here, you see this strange Article 9 that I bet not many have heard about. This is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, and it's a section of the Japanese Constitution adopted in 1946, immediately after the surrender of Japan, declaring Japan a pacifist country that cannot have involvement in international warfare, and its army is limited to small domestic issues. And since it's been about 70 plus years since the adoption of the Japanese Constitution, there has been ongoing debate in Japan concerning Article 9 and to what extent it should remain valid today, or perhaps if Japan wants to engage in global affairs and to contribute to peacekeeping efforts around the world, it ought to perhaps change Article 9 and become less pacifist and perhaps more involved in global affairs via peacekeeping missions, okay? So just one final slide in that context, so that we understand that we are not just talking about the UK or Spain or Japan, we are also talking perhaps more exotic settings. So the top half, the entire impeachment in Brazil saga. Those of you who follow the news will know that President Dilma Rousseff was impeached inter alia via the Brazilian Supreme Court and invoking relevant sections of the Constitution of Brazil, 1988. And in the bottom here, we see something that made some noise in Germany due to some dubious German connections, the impeachment of the South Korean Prime Minister back in 2016. And what we see here is the South Korean Constitutional Court essentially forcing with its decision the Prime Minister of South Korea to step down. So the bottom line of all of this, constitutions have become dramatically significant around the world in various ways, and what I want to do now is perhaps focus or zoom in on several more concrete aspects that are relevant to our conference and the potential contribution and perhaps somewhat to some extent limitations of comparative constitutionalism to peace, sustainability, development worldwide. So what we see here, hey, you wanted science, this is science, graphs, okay? So what you see here is, well, you see here three things. So here we talk about what we call social rights. So what are social rights? I'll explain this in a minute. So what are social rights? So in constitutional law, we talk about several categories of rights, but one of the main categories is social rights. So these are rights for, healthcare, education, welfare, the right to work, the right to basic housing conditions, all those things that require the state to do more, not less. So these are different than, say, the right to freedom of expression, when the idea is that the state should, do less and allow the private sphere to control the situation. When we talk about social rights or positive rights, we want more state. There has been, and this is relevant obviously to the theme of our conference here when we talk about development, there has been a tremendous growth in the world's constitutions in protecting those rights to healthcare, education, housing, welfare, and so on. So not good. What we see here is the dramatic increase, the blue line of the blue line in the top graph, the dramatic increase of the number of constitutions worldwide that have at least one social right in their Bill of Rights. Okay, so again, at least one. And obviously you can see that all new constitutions include something like that. And in the middle graph here, we see the average or mean of social rights in constitutions. And here too, we see that as the years go by, we now talk about the average social number of social rights per any random constitution would be 7. 7 different provisions that protect those rights. This is obviously significant. And I want to zoom in for a minute on the right to healthcare. That is very relevant to the theme here. So you see at the bottom, we talk about the percentage of countries with a constitutional right to health has grown from 24% of the constitutions in 1946 to 73% of the constitution in 2016. And if you factor in the increasing number of constitutions, you will understand that we talk about 24% of the constitutions back in 46. Recall the graph that I showed earlier. So in terms of actual numbers, we talk about the growth that is 5, 6, 7 times of what the situation was in protecting the right to healthcare. The effect of this expansion of the right to healthcare in global constitutions has been nothing short of dramatic. And of course, I cannot spend more than a minute talking about this, so we will focus on one decision, just to show you how significant this is. This is a decision from India, 2013, Novartis, that many of you will know as a major Swiss-based pharmaceutical company. Novartis versus India. So what Novartis, who otherwise is a socially responsible company, wanted to do is to extend a patent for a crucial cancer drug in India. If you extend the patent to a drug, that means that only Novartis can produce it and the price go up, as opposed to producing it as in a generic fashion that of course reduces the price significantly. And so a number of social activists in India took the case to the Supreme Court of India. We won't go through the specific details, but the Supreme Court of India ruled in a dramatic decision that very few of us have heard about, even though it is absolutely critical for understanding healthcare in India. We are talking 1.2, 1.3 billion people here. Ruled that Novartis cannot extend the patent over that anti-cancer drug beyond the initial period, and with its decision, essentially opened the door for generic drug production of that particular drug and lowering the cost of that drug to 10% of what per unit of what Novartis charged and wanted to continue to charge. So we understand that this is quite significant. Let's move, of course I could go on, but let's move on to, our time is limited, so let's move on to another area that is relevant to our discussion here, protection of the environment, that came up in some of the welcome speeches today, protection of the environment. So obviously this is a major issue and worldwide, and constitutions have started to do their role in that context too. So you don't have to read all of this, I will just explain. In an increasing number of constitutions, the right to nature and the right to healthy, clean environment has become present and significant. And surprisingly or not, the world leaders here are countries such as New Zealand, India, and quite a few countries in Latin America, in particular Ecuador, who has taken a very progressive approach in a number of issues. Some are good, some are not that amazing, in a number of areas, but it is a world pioneer in the context of environmental protection. So just to be clear, the Constitution of Ecuador protects straightforward nature, or Pachamama, which is nature in native language, where life is reproduced and occurs and so on. And notice the bottom, the state shall give incentives to protect nature and to promote respect for ecosystems. And this is in the Constitution. So this is not just I don't want to take lightly ordinary laws, but this is in the Ecuadorian Constitution, right? It's quite a commitment, it's quite a statement. Okay, so this is in the context of environmental protection. So we just explored quickly healthcare, the right to healthcare, environmental protection. Let's talk about another aspect that is quite significant. And those of you can notice, you'll see that we don't have the time to go, but New Zealand, India, and other places have extended this protection to rivers and forests and that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's quite radical. Let's move on to discuss another area that is significant for our theme today, diversity. What is this beautiful building? It is the building of the South African Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court of South Africa, the building, the place itself. You immediately notice something quite striking there. You see the words Constitutional Court appear there somewhere, but there are, the Constitutional Court appears in several other languages. This is on the building itself. So this clearly signals the multicultural diversity-oriented nature of the new South Africa, in, of course, stark contrast to the old South Africa of the apartheid. So as you all know, South Africa underwent a major transition to a more democratic, inclusive constitutional order in 96-97, and it is reflected on the building of the South African Constitutional Court. And this is the preamble. We all know what preamble is, you know, the initial statement of the Constitution of South Africa, the new Constitution, and we immediately, again, in line with what we saw earlier, see something quite incredible here. So it says, we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. May God protect our people, and then something quite amazing. Imagine this in the German context, just try to envision this. In the Constitution of South Africa, the God bless South Africa traditional ending of those preambles appears in 6 languages, and 4 of them are native languages, and one is English, and the other, quite strikingly, is right here in Afrikaans, that is often associated with some of the evils of the apartheid regime. So it clearly tells you how inclusive this constitutional order, and you take into account what we saw earlier with the Constitutional Court, we have clearly a new direction here, okay? Interesting. So another, and of course the South African flag that you know, obviously also signals that commitment to diversity and inclusiveness and multiculturalism. But since I am from Canada, you are not going to escape without some Canadian stuff. So who are these beautiful people? The lovely Queen in, let's say, blue there. Granted, she was 35 years younger than she is now. This is 1982, and the occasion is the adoption of the Constitution Act 1982 in Canada, which essentially cut the constitutional ties once and for all between Canada and the UK. And so Canada became independent in 1867, but it became formally or constitutionally absolutely free in 1982, just 35 years ago. And it also signals, as part of this Constitution Act 1982, the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that is our Bill of Rights, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and I will show you in a minute its commitment to diversity. But before we do this, who is the other guy there? Anyone recognizes him? Especially the people of course, bingo. I wanted to say especially the people of my generation and older, because obviously the younger crowd will never know. So the younger crowd here is familiar, of course, with the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And I had some comments on Pierre Elliott Trudeau's appearance and the appearance of the looks of his son, but I'll save this. It's not the right forum to say this, but in private maybe later. But this is indeed Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the great Canadian leader of the late 70s and early 80s, who was the architect or the mastermind behind the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this is the moment where the UK finally let Canada go, so to speak. And why is this relevant to our conversation? Because the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is arguably the most inclusive and the most explicit in its straightforward constitutional commitment for diversity and multiculturalism. So let's see what we have here. I just copied here 3 provisions of the Canadian Bill of Rights, the Canadian Constitution, and the first section that I copied here talks about official languages of Canada, and it officially establishes bilingualism, English and French, as the 2 official languages of Canada. The other one, section 27, is perhaps even more important for our purposes because it reads as follows: this charter shall be interpreted in a manner consistent with the preservation and enhancement of the multicultural heritage of Canadians. So it's an instruction to the Supreme Court of Canada to interpret the Constitution in a way that is inclusive and in line with the multicultural heritage of the country. Straightforward in the Constitution. Again, and just think about the German Basic Law as a comparator, and keep in mind, the German Basic Law is one of the most advanced, progressive documents of its kind. So just compare this to what we see here in Canada, what we saw in South Africa, to understand the context and how progressive this is. And section 35 says, protects, I will save you the details, protecting the rights of, the term in Canada is Aboriginal peoples, First Nations, the indigenous populations of Canada in variety of places throughout Canada and different origins. So, to sum up this point, the more progressive constitutions around the world have established a tremendously open, relatively speaking, regime, certainly if we compare those to the American Constitution. So despite the social diversity out there, the Constitution itself does not reflect that. Or if we talk about some European constitutions that are quite rigid in protecting one single national identity and one single national language and heritage and all these things. So we see a different trend around the world. So far so good, and we have a very, quite rosy picture here, but of course the situation is more complex. So we've seen the contribution to healthcare, we've seen the contribution to the protection of the environment, we've seen the contribution to diversity and multiculturalism, but there are some difficulties, obviously. So what we see here, another graph, and I apologize for its somewhat shady quality. So this is stuff that's produced by the World Bank, by the research department of the World Bank. And what we see here is something quite striking. So what we see here, maybe I should step down and show you this from here, because I control this red dot there. So this is the extra gains that World Capital, can you still hear me? This is the extra gains that World Capital made through all sorts of investments from 1988 to 2008, so those 20 years, and we see that, and who collected the benefits. So we see that if you zoom in here, the top 1% of the world rich collected 27% of the extra wealth produced through those years. And here we see that the second percentile collected another 25%, translation, 52% of the extra wealth, more than half of the extra wealth produced or generated in the world during those years was collected by 2% of the population. And if we extend this to the top decile, the top 10%, it adds up to more than 2/3. And of course, we see what's going on here. So virtually either nothing or close to nothing. So, obviously that creates a major challenge, and it is fair to say that constitutions are quite good in some things, but are not very good in preventing, or at least slowing down, the accumulation of wealth and the growth or rise of global inequality in that respect, not so much in the global sense, but more even intra-country respect. This is not to say that constitutions do not have a distributive effect. They do have. So let's look at something closer to home here. Many of you, I hope the minister here will recognize what we are seeing here. So this is something that produced by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. We can, of course, argue about the details and the data and the methods, but let's leave all of this aside. But we see here that through some constitutionally entrenched provisions, the German Federation has been able, as a polity, has been able to channel some extra resources from the more well-off Länder and move them to the less well-off Länder through all sorts of mechanisms, and we're going to save you all the details, and I suspect that some of you know the details better than I do, or the day-to-day of this. And again, some of this data is contested, we can argue about this, but ultimately the big picture is the German Basic Law and some provisions in the German Basic Law allow for transfer of, allows for the transfer of tremendous amount of money from Hamburg, from Bavaria, from Hessen, etc., to somewhere here. Okay? And this is done, we take this for granted, but it's not. This is done through constitutional provisions in the Basic Law. Yes? Okay. This is what is going on, and we here close the circle and go back to the US when we started in Germany and the US, so you don't think that all of this is just exotic destinations, Ecuador and all these places. No, this is very close to home. So in the US, or in contrast to Germany and Canada, the United States does not have a form of constitutionally entrenched horizontal equalization. So this mechanism that we just talked about in Germany, there is none in the American Constitution. Of course, there are other ways to transfer money through the federal government, but not through the Constitution. So the effects of differential annual GDP per capita in, of course, Connecticut, New York, or Massachusetts on, are not constitutionally mitigated against other states in the US that have significantly lower GDP per capita. And you compare this to the German situation. I wanted to save you another graph, so we will keep this to just 5 examples at the bottom here. So consequently, because we don't have anything like that in the US, the annual public spending capacity per capita vary considerably among states in the US. So it's about $9,000. These are 2015 numbers, so perhaps today it's more. It's about $9,000 per year per capita public spending in places like Oregon, Massachusetts, or Connecticut. Parentheses, this is my own observation there, all voted Clinton, while it stands at just $4,000 of public spending per person in places like Missouri, or even $3,500 in Florida, and both voted Trump. Of course, you can draw whatever conclusions you want from this, but one conclusion is obvious. The lack of such constitutionally entrenched transfer equalization mechanisms has had some non-trivial, and I could use even more dramatic words, some non-trivial effects on political outcomes. And I'm not saying this is the only reason, of course not. There are numerous reasons. This is a major political phenomenon, and it reflects a confluence of factors. But clearly this is one of them. Whereas in Germany and in other countries, we do not have at least that problem. So what are we to learn from all of this? And I know the minister wants to speak too, so I will maybe cut it short soon. So what are we to learn out of this? I think we can learn those two things. We can learn that constitutional law is not merely or even primarily about law. It is about how we want to live as a society and as a political community. And if we take a look at those constitutions and what they actually say, and at the constitutional jurisprudence, it's a difficult word, I'll admit. Constitutional jurisprudence is the actual body of constitutional court decisions, how they actually interpret the text. If we take a look at the constitutional text, at the constitutional jurisprudence, constitutional practice, we will get a fairly good understanding of the social and political preferences in a given place, how we want to live as a society. So this is a window, if you will, for understanding local culture, local politics, local society in an interesting way and in a significant way. I also had a sentence there that because constitutional law is not merely or even primarily about law, and because it is about how we want to live as a society and as a political community, it is way too important to be left in the hands of lawyers. But since there are some, my friends, law professors in the crowd, I did not include it there, but I said it nonetheless. It is an important, it is, yeah, next time you give a speech, you will, yeah, it's a tennis game that we play. But you will understand that I subscribe to the view that constitutional law is first and foremost a political instrument, and it's a window to a given society's social preferences, cultural preferences, economic preferences, political preferences. The second insight that I want to leave you with, directly related to the theme of the conference, is this. Constitutionalism has become the lingua franca, the Esperanto, whatever image you want to use, the lingua franca of social and political discourse worldwide. I mean, in this talk alone, 30 minutes or so, we sailed through some 25, 30 countries without even paying attention to it. It's the Esperanto of social and political discourse today. There's no serious political change, serious social change, without reference to constitutionalism, constitutional rights, constitutional decisions. We as social scientists, and that includes law professors, because I treat law professors as social scientists. We as social scientists hold the duty and responsibility to increase public awareness to constitutionalism and to enlighten our students and the public about the tremendous potential of constitutionalism alongside its inherent limitations. And this is what I was trying to do in the last few minutes. So we absolutely cannot discuss social change, political change, and serious political identity without paying attention to this increasingly significant universe of comparative constitutionalism. And it is, just to restate what's on the board there, all of us are here in the business of science. It is our collective responsibility not just to produce science for our own sake or for our own indulgence, but to generate significant insights that influence the real world out there. And we all know that the core sciences are quite good at selling their product as improving life out there. The social sciences and the humanities often lack that extra oomph, but this is a mistake. And comparative constitutionalism is one of those areas that absolutely must be put at the forefront of our scientific efforts so that we can understand the political universe around us and perhaps make it a better world. Thank you very much.